It was a resort described as a paradise, a place where the silence was so profound that people felt safe enough to leave their doors unlocked. But that fatal sense of security set the stage for the most perplexing disappearance of the modern era. There were no signs of forced entry, no screams, only a shutter raised and a bed left cold and empty. While the world's police forces chased the shadow of a random intruder, the private detective's confidential file suggests a far darker reality. This was not random. It was a commissioned job, a planned operation that spiraled into a catastrophe because the perpetrator panicked. Is it possible that the global media explosion, intended to save a life, actually forced a criminal to destroy the only evidence of their crime? Today, we reopen the full file on Praia da Luz to examine the theories the cameras missed. Before we enter the scene, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to support this in-depth investigation. The timeline begins in May of 2007, in a town where the quiet was the deadliest trap of all. The date was the 3rd of May, 2007. A timeline that would soon become etched into the annals of criminal history as the beginning of one of the most perplexing disappearances of the modern era. The location was Praia da Luz in the Algarve region of Portugal, a destination renowned for its tranquility and perceived safety. It was within this context that the McCann family, alongside a group of friends who would later be scrutinized by the media as the Tapas 7, were vacationing at the Ocean Club Resort. To the casual observer, the setting appeared idyllic, yet retrospective analysis suggests that this perception of security was dangerously misleading. As noted in later investigations, the area was incredibly quiet, a place where residents and tourists alike felt comfortable leaving doors unlocked, fostering a relaxed atmosphere that would ultimately prove to be a critical vulnerability. The investigative focus centers on the specific apartment occupied by the family. It was a ground-floor unit, a detail that security experts and private investigators would later highlight as a significant oversight in the protection of the family. The layout of the apartment complex was open, and crucially, the unit in question was situated at a corner, making it the most accessible point for any external actor navigating the streets. Unlike a secure hotel room, located on a high floor with monitored hallways, this accommodation offered a direct interface with the public road. Investigative reports emphasize that the window of the room where the daughter slept faced the street, creating a perilous lack of separation between the private living quarters and the public domain. This architectural flaw meant that the boundary between safety and danger was merely a window shutter, a shutter that, according to the private detective who later reviewed the case, could be lifted with alarming ease and without the need for force. On that specific evening, the routine of the group was established with a casualness that would later be dissected by millions. The parents and their friends were dining at a restaurant within the complex, situated only a few meters away from the apartment where the daughter and her siblings were resting. The proximity was deceptive. While the distance was physically short, the visual obstruction and the ambient noise of the dinner created a disconnect. This arrangement relied heavily on the assumption that the resort was a sanctuary, a bubble immune to external threats. However, forensic analysis of the scene later confirmed that there were no signs of forced entry, no shattered glass, and no damaged locks. This absence of violence in the entry method supports the theory that the perpetrator did not need to use force, but rather capitalized on the existing vulnerabilities of the location, specifically the unlocked or easily manipulated points of access. The timeline of the disappearance pivots on the moment the alarm was raised. The transition from a mundane holiday dinner to a high-stakes crisis occurred in an instant. When the mother went to check on the family members, the discovery was not one of intrusion in the traditional sense, but of a chilling absence. The bed was empty. The shutter, which should have been closed, was open. This specific detail regarding the shutter is paramount. It transformed the investigation from a potential case of wandering off to one of abduction. The immediate aftermath was chaotic, with the local police and the British authorities eventually collaborating, yet facing significant hurdles due to jurisdictional differences and the initial lack of protocol for such a high-profile event. From an analytical perspective, the disappearance presents conflicting narratives. On one hand, the parents were initially subjected to intense scrutiny, designated as formal suspects or arguidos by the Portuguese authorities, a status that allowed for aggressive questioning but was later discarded due to a lack of evidence linking them to any crime. On the other hand, the theory of a planned abduction gained traction among private investigators. The detective engaged by the support fund later posited that this was not a random act of opportunity by a common thief. Nothing of monetary value was reported stolen from the apartment, ruling out a burglary gone wrong. Instead, the evidence, or the lack thereof, pointed toward a specific objective: the removal of the individual. The investigator suggested that the operation might have been organized but poorly executed, perhaps a transaction or an abduction for specific networks that panicked due to the unforeseen global media explosion. The silence of Praia da Luz that night was broken, not just by the panic of the parents, but by the realization that the resort's open nature was its greatest flaw. The Ocean Club was effectively a colony of British tourists, staffed by transient seasonal workers, which complicated the later efforts to track witnesses or suspicious individuals. By the time private investigators arrived on the scene months later, the crime scene was cold, the resort was closed, and the potential witnesses had dispersed, leaving behind a vacuum of information. This initial delay and the contamination of the scene in the first 24 hours are often cited by experts as the primary reasons why. Nearly 2 decades later, there is still no confession, no resolution, and no recovery of the missing individual. The empty bed remains the most enduring image of the case, a symbol of a secure environment that failed to protect its occupant. The immediate aftermath of the alarm being raised at the Ocean Club Resort is often cited by criminologists as the most critical phase of the entire timeline, a period conventionally known as the Golden Hour. In standard investigative protocols, the actions taken or not taken within this short window frequently determine the trajectory of the entire case. Retrospective analysis of the events in Praia da Luz suggests that the initial response was marred by a collision between the frantic emotional state of the family and the procedural limitations of a local holiday environment. When the mother returned to the table where the group was dining to announce the disappearance, the transition from a leisure atmosphere to a high-stakes emergency was instantaneous. However, experts observing the case have frequently pointed out that the preservation of the physical scene in these early moments is paramount, and in this specific instance, the preservation appears to have been compromised by the sheer panic of the search efforts. As the news rippled through the complex, a frantic search began, involving not just the parents and their dining companions, but also the resort staff and other tourists. While this mass mobilization was driven by a desperate desire to locate the missing subject quickly, it inadvertently created a forensic nightmare. Dozens of individuals were moving in and out of the apartment and the surrounding areas, potentially trampling vital evidence, contaminating DNA samples, and disturbing the layout of the room. Reports indicate that the local law enforcement, the Guardia Nacional Republicana, arrived first. Their initial assessment was seemingly influenced by the lack of forced entry, because the apartment door showed no signs of damage and there was no immediate evidence of a struggle. The initial working theory skewed towards the possibility that the individual had simply wandered off. This assumption, while standard in many missing person reports, may have delayed the activation of more rigorous abduction protocols, such as the immediate sealing of the crime scene and the total lockdown of the surrounding perimeter. The discrepancy between the local police response and the expectations of the British family became a focal point of tension almost immediately. The investigation required the involvement of the Policia Judiciaria, the specialized criminal investigation agency, but the handover and the coordination between these entities consumed valuable time. During these crucial hours, the hypothesis of a botched removal or an organized abduction began to form in the background. As later noted by private investigators, if a perpetrator had indeed taken the individual, they would have been navigating a race against time. The private detective, who later analyzed the case, theorized that a kidnapper might have been attempting to move the subject, but would have been acutely aware of the risks associated with border controls and police patrols. However, the effectiveness of these blockades during the very first night remains a subject of debate. Critics argue that if the roads and borders were not sealed instantly, a perpetrator could have moved the subject out of the immediate search zone before the dragnet was fully established. Simultaneously, a phenomenon of unprecedented scale was beginning to take shape: the media mobilization. Within the first 24 hours, what started as a local missing person report exploded into a media show of global reach. Television crews, journalists, and photographers began descending on the small Portuguese village, transforming it into an international stage. This rapid media saturation is highly atypical for disappearances across Europe, where many similar cases unfortunately go relatively unnoticed. The presence of the media had a dual effect. On one hand, it disseminated the image of the missing subject to the entire world, theoretically increasing the chances of recognition. On the other hand, it placed immense pressure on the local authorities and potentially alerted the perpetrators to the magnitude of their actions. The private investigator suggested that this intense spotlight might have panicked those responsible, forcing them to abandon their original plans or take drastic measures to conceal their involvement. The behavior of the parents during this initial window was also catalogued and later scrutinized. They were thrust into a nightmare. Yet they also managed to mobilize a significant support network almost immediately. The quick involvement of high-profile figures and the immediate establishment of a communication strategy set this case apart from others. However, this high-level attention also created a complex dynamic for the investigators on the ground. The pressure to produce results was compounded by the involvement of political and diplomatic figures, creating an environment where standard police work was constantly under the microscope of the global press. The private detective noted that the parents were not viewed as normal in the traditional sense, given the father's potential political standing and the sophisticated nature of the support they received. This elevated status meant that the first 24 hours were not just a police operation, but a public relations management crisis, a factor that some argue may have distracted from the raw, ground-level forensic work needed to solve the mystery. By the time the sun rose over the Algarve the following morning, the window of opportunity for a hot pursuit had largely closed. The timeline had shifted from a rescue operation to a complex, multi-jurisdictional investigation. The apartment had been visited by too many people, the roads had remained open for too long, and the story had already escaped the control of the local precinct to become a global headline. The failure to secure the scene and lock down the area in those initial hours created a void of evidence that has haunted the case ever since. As the investigation moved forward, the lack of a body, the lack of a confession, and the lack of resolution could all be traced back to the chaotic, uncoordinated events of that first long night. The world was watching, but the vital clues that might have resolved the disappearance were likely lost in the confusion of the first 24 hours. The transformation of the investigation from a local inquiry into a worldwide media phenomenon occurred with a speed that baffled seasoned observers. Within a mere 24 hours of the initial report, a media show of global reach had been mounted, encompassing television networks, radio stations, and the printing press, particularly those from the United Kingdom. This immediate and intense saturation created a unique environment for the investigation, one where every move by the local police was scrutinized by an international audience. The private detective who later joined the inquiry noted this anomaly, questioning why this specific case garnered such unprecedented attention when individuals vanish across Europe, Spain, and England with disturbing frequency, yet rarely receive a fraction of such coverage. This disparity suggests that the case had transcended the realm of a standard disappearance to become a symbolic event, driven by factors that extended beyond the immediate facts of the crime scene. The machinery behind this global awareness was not accidental, but appeared to be bolstered by high-level support that is atypical for an ordinary family. The parents were not navigating this crisis alone. They were rapidly surrounded by a sophisticated support network. The private investigator highlighted the involvement of influential figures, noting that the family received support from wealthy benefactors, such as Brian Kennedy, and even captured the attention of cultural icons like the author of the Harry Potter series. Furthermore, the reach of their campaign extended to the highest spiritual levels, as evidenced by the fact that the parents were received by the Pope. This elevation of the case to a cause célèbre raises critical questions about social status and the allocation of public sympathy. The detective pointed out that the parents were presented as a normal doctor and his wife from a small English town. Yet subsequent information suggested the father was a person of significant professional standing who could have been a contender for the position of Minister of Health had the political tides turned differently. This perception of influence was further reinforced by the structure of the organization established to manage the search. The fund created to finance the investigation operated with a level of professionalism that mirrored a corporate or political campaign. The private investigator noted that the people involved in managing this fund were not normal in the sense of being average citizens. For instance, the spokesperson chosen for the fund was a former government official responsible for communications and public relations within the British administration. The presence of such a high-caliber spin doctor managing the narrative suggests a strategic approach to media management that kept the story on the front pages for years. This strategic management ensured that the case never faded from the public consciousness, a privilege not afforded to countless other families in similar situations. The financial aspect of the investigation also became a subject of controversy and analysis regarding resource inequality. The investigation by British authorities, specifically Scotland Yard, was endowed with extra funding on multiple occasions to continue the search. This exceptional allocation of public funds sparked debate about the hierarchy of victims. The private detective recalled a specific instance where another mother, whose son had disappeared in the United Kingdom, publicly voiced her frustration. She questioned why the police force was granted thousands of pounds to investigate this specific case in Portugal, while her own son's disappearance received no such dedicated resources or personnel. This sentiment highlights a grim reality of the justice system, that the visibility of a case often dictates the resources applied to it, potentially leaving less photogenic or less connected victims in the shadows. From an investigative standpoint, the circus surrounding the case may have had detrimental effects alongside the raised awareness. The detective theorized that this overwhelming attention might have altered the behavior of those responsible. If this was indeed a kidnapping, the sheer magnitude of the global reaction, the police presence, the border checks, and the media saturation could have panicked the perpetrators. A criminal expecting a quiet transaction or a local search would have been confronted with a scenario where the entire world was watching. This pressure cooker environment might have forced a change in plans, leading to a hasty and perhaps tragic disposal of evidence, rather than a negotiation or recovery. Ultimately, the global phenomenon that was meant to bring the individual home may have inadvertently sealed the perimeter, making movement impossible and resolution infinitely more complex. The question remains whether the media glare illuminated the truth or merely blinded the investigation. The narrative of the investigation underwent a seismic shift in the months following the initial disappearance, moving from a story of universal sympathy to one of intense scrutiny directed at the family itself. This transition marked a complex phase in the inquiry where the parents, initially viewed solely as victims of a tragic event, found themselves at the center of a legal and forensic storm. The Portuguese authorities, facing mounting pressure to resolve the case, made the controversial decision to designate the mother and father as arguidos, a specific legal status within the Portuguese judicial system. This classification, often misunderstood by the international public, does not equate to a formal charge of guilt, but rather indicates that an individual is a formal suspect, granting them certain legal protections, while allowing investigators to ask more probing and direct questions. This development introduced a stark cultural clash between the British legal expectations of the family and the procedural realities of the Portuguese police, creating a friction that played out aggressively in the global media. The basis for this suspicion was rooted in forensic interpretations that later became the subject of fierce debate among criminologists. Specialized canines, trained to detect specific biological markers, were deployed to examine the apartment and the vehicle rented by the family weeks after the incident. The reaction of these animals led investigators to hypothesize that the disappearance might not have been an abduction, but rather an accidental event concealed within the family unit. This theory posited that an accident had occurred in the apartment and that the subsequent chaos was an elaborate cover-up. However, legal analysts have since pointed out the dangers of relying solely on canine alerts without corroborating physical evidence. The lack of a body and the inconclusive nature of the DNA analysis meant that this line of inquiry remained circumstantial. Yet it cast a long shadow over the reputation of the parents, fueling tabloid speculation that persisted for years. Private investigators who entered the case later provided a different perspective on the parents' demeanor and credibility. When the private detective agency from Spain was approached to take over the search, they established a rigorous vetting process before accepting the mandate. According to the lead detective, the team refused to simply accept the contract. Instead, they conducted a series of separate, intensive interviews with both the mother and the father. The objective was to subject them to a battery of questions to assess the consistency of their accounts and to detect any signs of deception. The detective noted that only after this exhaustion of questioning, and being satisfied with the answers provided by the parents separately, did the agency agree to proceed with the investigation. This private vetting served as a counter-narrative to the official police suspicion, suggesting that seasoned professionals who interacted directly with the family found no evidence of complicity. The scrutiny on the parents also brought their professional and social standing into sharp focus. The investigation revealed that the father was not merely a local physician, but a figure of significant potential prominence, with intelligence suggesting he had the credentials to attain high governmental office, potentially even as a minister of health, had political circumstances been different. This detail added a layer of complexity to the public perception, raising questions about whether their status influenced the resources allocated to their defense and the management of the media narrative. The private investigator remarked that the parents and the entourage managing the support fund were not normal citizens in the conventional sense, but individuals with access to high-level networks and sophisticated public relations machinery. This power dynamic often led to friction with local investigators who may have felt outmaneuvered by the family's media strategy. Ultimately, the arguido status was lifted, and the parents were formally cleared of any suspicion by the Portuguese Attorney General's office due to a lack of evidence. The investigation into the parents was archived, allowing the focus to return to the search for an external perpetrator. However, the psychological toll of this period was immense. The family was forced to navigate the dual burden of grieving the absence of their daughter while simultaneously defending their innocence against a global audience. The false suspect phenomenon observed here serves as a case study in modern criminal justice, highlighting how the absence of a clear resolution can lead investigators to turn inward, sometimes confusing the erratic behavior of trauma with the calculated behavior of guilt. Despite the legal clearance, the period in the spotlight left an indelible mark on the case, creating a divide in public opinion that persists even as new suspects have emerged. As the official inquiry by local and international police forces began to stagnate, hindered by bureaucratic friction and jurisdictional disputes, the trajectory of the case shifted toward the private sector. This transition marked a significant evolution in the search efforts, driven by the entity known as the Fund, an organization established to manage the financial resources donated by the public to assist in the recovery of the missing individual. Investigative sources indicate that the Fund, acting somewhat independently from the immediate family structure, had initially contracted a British private investigator to advance the case. However, reports suggest that this initial private engagement yielded little in terms of actionable intelligence or clarity, prompting the organizers to reassess their strategy and look beyond the United Kingdom for professional assistance. The decision to turn towards Spanish detectives was not merely a matter of convenience, but a calculated strategic move based on geography and regulatory frameworks. Spain shares the Iberian Peninsula with Portugal, offering a logistical proximity that British investigators could not match. Furthermore, the private detective who later spearheaded this phase of the inquiry highlighted that Spain is considered a pioneer in the regulation of private investigation. Unlike in many other jurisdictions where the industry can be opaque or unregulated, the Spanish model provided a level of professional legitimacy and accountability that the fund deemed necessary for a case under such intense global scrutiny. This combination of geographic access to the Algarve region and a robust legal framework for private inquiries made the Spanish agency the logical successor to the failed initial attempts. However, the engagement between the Spanish agency and the family was not automatic. The lead detective revealed that the agency did not simply accept the assignment upon being contacted. Rather, they approached the proposition with a high degree of professional skepticism. Before any contract was signed or any field operations commenced, the investigators established a strict prerequisite. They required direct access to the parents to conduct their own assessment. This step was crucial to the integrity of their operation, as they needed to determine for themselves whether the clients were truthful before committing resources to the search. The protocol involved a series of intensive interviews, described by the detective as a battery of questions, which were administered to the father and the mother separately. This method of separate interviewing is a standard interrogation technique designed to identify inconsistencies in testimonies. By isolating the subjects, investigators can compare their accounts of the timeline, their emotional responses, and specific details of the event to see if they align perfectly or if discrepancies emerge that might suggest fabrication. The detective noted that this process was rigorous and necessary to rule out any involvement of the family in the disappearance, a theory that had plagued the police investigation. It was only after this exhaustive vetting process, when the answers provided by both parents were deemed consistent and credible, that the agency decided to formally accept the case. This vetting served as a private clearance of the parents, distinct from the public legal battles they were fighting. Once the mandate was accepted, the nature of the investigation changed fundamentally. The private detectives were not bound by the diplomatic protocols that constrained the police forces of different nations. Their objective was clear but daunting: to step into a cold trail. By the time they were brought on board, the initial critical window had long passed. The detective noted that upon their arrival, the resort, the specific holiday complex where the disappearance occurred, had already closed for the season. The environment had changed drastically. The staff members who were present on the night of the incident were no longer there, and the physical setting had been altered by the passage of time. This delay meant that the private investigators were starting with a significant handicap. They were tasked with reconstructing a scene that no longer existed in its original form. The challenge was to locate and interview transient staff members, waiters, cleaners, and maintenance workers who had dispersed after the resort closed. The detective emphasized that in the Algarve region, many businesses are British-owned, creating a sort of colony dynamic where staff are often seasonal and mobile. Tracking down these individuals required a different set of skills than standard police work, relying on persistence and the ability to navigate the expatriate community. The acceptance of the case by the Spanish team marked the beginning of a new, albeit difficult, chapter, an attempt to find answers in a silence that had already settled over the town for months. By the time the private investigative team from Spain arrived in Portugal to commence their inquiries on the ground, the operational landscape had fundamentally shifted from an active crime scene to a cold, dormant environment. The lead detective noted a significant logistical hurdle immediately upon their deployment. The Ocean Club, the resort complex where the disappearance took place, was already closed for the season. This closure meant that the bustling holiday atmosphere that characterized the night of the incident had evaporated, leaving behind a vacuum that made the reconstruction of events exceptionally difficult. The physical setting was accessible, but the human element, the witnesses, the staff, and the daily rhythm of the location had largely vanished. forcing the investigators to work backward through a timeline that had already grown cold. A critical component of the investigation involved understanding the unique socio-economic fabric of the Algarve region. The detective described the area as operating almost like a British colony, a detail that was essential for understanding the flow of information and the nature of the witnesses. In this part of Portugal, a vast number of businesses, including the golf courses and the hotels, are owned and operated by British entities. This cultural dominance meant that the investigation was not merely a Portuguese matter, but one that was deeply entrenched in the British expatriate community. The resort itself was a hub for this specific demographic, which influenced how the investigators approached the task of gathering intelligence. They were navigating a foreign jurisdiction that was simultaneously insulated by a specific cultural and linguistic bubble. The primary challenge resulting from the resort's closure was the dispersal of the workforce. The detective highlighted that the personnel who were present during the critical period were no longer on site. The staff at the Ocean Club, particularly those at the service level, such as waiters and maintenance crews, were largely seasonal employees. In the hospitality industry of the Algarve, it is common for workers to migrate with the seasons, arriving for the peak tourist months and departing once the establishments close their doors. Consequently, when the Spanish team initiated their search, the potential witnesses who might have observed something suspicious in the dining area or around the apartment were scattered, potentially having moved to different regions or even returned to their home countries. This transience necessitated a tedious and complex process of human mapping. The investigation could not simply rely on walking into the resort and questioning the staff on duty. Instead, the team had to begin by locating the individuals who had worked there previously. Each waiter, cleaner, and receptionist had to be identified through employment records and then tracked down individually to be interviewed. This delay introduced a significant margin for error, as human memory is notoriously malleable over time. Asking a seasonal worker to recall specific faces or unusual behaviors from months prior is far less reliable than an immediate interview conducted in the wake of an event. The investigators were fighting against the erosion of memory, trying to extract precise details from individuals who had likely viewed their time at the resort as merely a temporary job. The reality of the revisited scene underscores the fragility of evidence in missing person cases. While the physical structures of the apartment and the streets remained constant, the dynamic environment, the people who populate the background of any crime scene, had dissolved. The private detectives were forced to reconstruct the Ocean Club, not as it stood before them in its closed state, but as it had existed months earlier. This retrospective investigation required them to piece together a puzzle where the pieces had been scattered across borders. The silence of the closed resort stood in stark contrast to the chaos of the initial media storm, serving as a physical reminder of the opportunities lost during the initial phases of the inquiry. The investigation had moved from a hot pursuit to a historical reconstruction, a shift that invariably favors the perpetrator over the pursuer. As the investigation deepened, the private detectives began to move away from the concept of a random, opportunistic crime and towards a far more complex and unsettling hypothesis. The lead investigator articulated a theory that challenged the initial perceptions of the case, suggesting that the disappearance was not a casual event but rather an organized operation that was fundamentally poorly executed. This perspective posits that the abduction was not the result of a wandering stranger stumbling upon an open window, but a calculated act that spiraled out of control due to unforeseen variables. The detective argued that the specific circumstances surrounding the family, their movement to that specific location, and the precise timing of the event pointed toward a scenario that was planned in advance but failed in its final delivery. The core of this botched job theory rests on the structure of criminal enterprises and the delegation of illegal tasks. The investigator hypothesized a chain of command, suggesting that the order to acquire the individual might have originated from a high level, perhaps commissioned through intermediaries such as law firms or specialized brokers in different countries. In this scenario, the entity requesting the abduction would never dirty their hands. Instead, the task would be subcontracted down a ladder of criminal associates. Eventually, the responsibility for the physical act would land on a low-level operator, someone perhaps paid a sum like €3,000 to simply retrieve the target and deliver them to a designated location. This fragmentation of responsibility creates a dangerous disconnect between the mastermind and the executor, introducing a margin for error that can have catastrophic consequences. According to this line of inquiry, the critical failure of the operation occurred in the immediate aftermath of the extraction. The theory suggests that the perpetrator, having successfully removed the individual from the apartment, was unprepared for the sheer scale of the reaction that followed. Within hours, the disappearance had triggered a global media firestorm and a massive police mobilization that included the sealing of borders and the patrolling of all major transit routes. The detective described a psychological pivot point where the abductor, likely holding the individual in a temporary safe house or vehicle, realized the impossibility of completing the transport. Confronted with roadblocks, port checks, and the face of the missing subject plastered on every television screen, the perpetrator would have succumbed to panic. This state of panic is where the narrative turns darkest. The investigator reasoned that a low-level criminal might view the situation as too high risk, potentially leading them to conceal the evidence to avoid detection. If the original plan was to transport the subject across a border or to a waiting buyer, the intense police pressure would have rendered that impossible. The detective theorized that in this moment of fear, see Akojona, the abductor's priorities shifted from profit to self-preservation. This shift often forces a drastic change in plans, leading to the grim possibility that the perpetrator chose to dispose of the subject to eliminate the liability, or perhaps hastily sold the individual to a different, more accessible network. The analysis of this theory also touches upon the anomalies regarding the family's profile, which the detective felt did not align with the standard demographic of random victims. The investigation noted that the father was a professional of significant standing, potentially on a trajectory for high political office, and that the support network surrounding them included influential figures from government and media sectors. These details reinforce the detective's belief that the target was selected specifically rather than at random. The argument is that a normal abduction for ransom or other purposes would have followed a more predictable pattern. Instead, the silence, the lack of a ransom demand, and the absence of a body all support the conclusion of a professional job that went tragically wrong due to the overwhelming public outcry. The botched job theory ultimately presents a chilling paradox. The very global attention intended to save the missing individual may have been the catalyst that forced the perpetrators to sever their ties, leaving investigators to chase a ghost created by a criminal's panic. The forensic reconstruction of the timeline inevitably leads investigators to examine the physical environment where the disappearance occurred, revealing a disturbing reality regarding the safety of the accommodation. While the Ocean Club was marketed as a family-friendly resort, the private detective who later assessed the site characterized the security measures as effectively non-existent. Unlike a traditional hotel structure, where guests must pass through a monitored lobby or navigate internal corridors covered by surveillance cameras, the apartment in question was situated within an open complex that interacted directly with the public domain. This architectural layout meant that the boundary between the private sanctuary of the family and the public street was perilously thin, creating a vulnerability that criminal profilers argue was the primary facilitator of the event. The specific location of the apartment within the complex is of paramount importance to the investigation. The unit was situated on the ground floor and positioned at a corner, a location that the private investigator identified as the most accessible point for any external actor. Crucially, the window of the room where the daughter was sleeping faced directly onto the street. This orientation provided a clear line of sight and approach for anyone passing by, eliminating the need for a perpetrator to navigate deep into the resort grounds where they might risk being seen by staff or other guests. The investigation highlights that for a predator seeking a target, this specific room represented the path of least resistance, offering a direct interface between the street and the interior of the dwelling. The mechanism of entry has been a subject of intense scrutiny, particularly regarding the window shutters. Although the parents believed the premises to be secure, The private detective noted that the external shutters could be raised with alarming ease from the outside. A simple lifting motion was all that was required to gain access, a design flaw that negated the need for brute force or specialized tools. This observation aligns with the official police reports, which stated that the room showed no signs of forced entry, such as shattered glass or broken locks. The absence of damage suggests that the perpetrator was likely aware of this vulnerability or discovered it quickly, allowing them to enter and exit the property in silence without alerting the neighbors or the parents dining nearby. The behavioral patterns of the group, referred to in the media as the Tapa 7, also contributed to the overall risk profile of the evening. The parents and their friends were dining at a restaurant located only a short distance from the apartments. While they established a system of checking on the sleeping individuals periodically, this routine may have inadvertently created a window of opportunity. Security analysts suggest that if the apartment was being watched, a pattern of movement would have been discernible. The predictability of the adult's location, combined with the physical exposure of the apartment to the street, created a scenario where a perpetrator could calculate the precise moments when the room was unattended. Furthermore, the atmosphere of the town itself played a role in the lowering of defenses. The detective described Praia da Luz as a location that was historically incredibly quiet and safe, a place where residents and tourists often felt comfortable leaving their doors unlocked. This pervasive sense of safety can often lead to complacency, a psychological state that criminals can exploit. The juxtaposition of a relaxed holiday environment with a complete lack of physical security measures described by the investigator as zero security transformed the apartment into a high-risk zone. In retrospect, the architectural and procedural flaws of the resort created a perfect storm of vulnerability, turning an unlocked window facing a public road into the critical failure point of the entire case. As the investigation moved beyond the immediate perimeter of the resort, the focus of the private detectives shifted toward the surrounding geography, specifically targeting a desolate location known as the barragem, or reservoir. This man-made body of water, situated inland from the coast, became a focal point of interest based on the theory that a perpetrator, acting in haste and panic, would seek the most accessible and definitive method to conceal evidence. The lead investigator operated on the grim but pragmatic principles of geographic profiling, which suggest that individuals seeking to dispose of incriminating material often gravitate toward bodies of water that are within a calculable distance from the primary scene. The team conducted a trajectory analysis, mapping out the routes that a vehicle could traverse quickly from the apartment to a secluded disposal site, and the reservoir emerged as a statistically significant probability. The private investigation team did not merely observe the water from the banks. They initiated an active search operation. The detective described the process as a calculated entry into the area, driven by a series of crossed leads, and the logical deduction that the reservoir offered the cover of depth and obscurity. During this operation, the tension of the inquiry reached a fever pitch when the team discovered skeletal remains near the water's edge. This find presented a critical decision point regarding the chain of custody. Rather than immediately handing the evidence over to the local Portuguese authorities, a relationship already strained by differing methodologies and the earlier suspect status of the parents, the private investigators opted to retain a portion of the samples. They transported these remains back to their home jurisdiction in Spain for independent forensic analysis by a trusted criminalist, ensuring that the results would be verified by their own experts. The subsequent forensic report provided a definitive but disheartening conclusion. The bones were determined to be of animal origin, not human. This result was a significant blow to the momentum of the private inquiry, serving as a stark reminder of the difficulties inherent in searching for biological evidence in a vast, open environment. While the discovery was ultimately irrelevant to the criminal case, it highlighted the thoroughness of the private strategy, which sought to physically verify every theoretical possibility, rather than relying solely on witness testimony or electronic data. The barragem was cleared by the private team at that time, and the investigation was forced to pivot back to other lines of inquiry, leaving the reservoir as yet another dead end in a growing list of frustrations. However, the relevance of this specific location was unexpectedly reignited nearly 2 decades later, validating the initial instincts of the Spanish detectives. In a development that captured global headlines, police forces, this time led by German authorities in collaboration with the Portuguese, returned to the exact same reservoir that the private team had scouted years prior. This renewed interest was reportedly linked to the emergence of the new suspect, a German national who had resided in the Algarve during the relevant time frame. The decision to revisit the site suggested that official intelligence finally aligned with the geographic profiling conducted by the private investigators 18 or 20 years earlier. The lead detective later expressed a sense of professional validation upon seeing the heavy machinery and police divers return to the site she had pinpointed, noting that her team had not been misguided in their original assessment of the terrain. The conditions of the search during this second official operation were drastically different due to environmental changes. The detective noted that the region had suffered from severe drought and the effects of climate change over the intervening years, causing the water levels of the reservoir to recede dramatically. Areas of the lakebed that had been submerged under meters of water during the initial search were now exposed as dry land. This shift in the landscape offered a new opportunity for forensic recovery, as the police were able to excavate soil and sediment that would have been inaccessible previously. The objective was to screen the earth for any biological remnants or synthetic fibers that might link the suspect to the missing individual, even after the passage of so much time. Despite the massive mobilization of resources during this later search, which included digging equipment and specialized cadaver dogs, no conclusive evidence linking the suspect to the disappearance was publicly announced as being found at the site. The reservoir stands as a symbol of the right place, wrong time paradox that often plagues cold cases. The private investigators were correct in identifying the location as a high-probability zone. Yet they lacked the forensic technology, or perhaps the sheer luck required to find the needle in the haystack. The emptiness of the reservoir mirrors the emptiness of the case itself, a location full of potential secrets that, despite being drained and dug up, has refused to yield the final answer regarding the fate of the missing individual. As the physical search on the ground in Portugal faced logistical hurdles, the investigation expanded into the digital realm, revealing a complex web of information that extended far beyond the borders of Europe. To facilitate the gathering of intelligence, the private investigative team established a dedicated 24-hour hotline and email service, staffed by operators capable of communicating in multiple languages. This initiative was designed to capture leads from the global public, but it also opened a gateway to the darker corners of the internet. The investigators were inundated with correspondence from around the world, ranging from well-meaning tips to disturbing communications that hinted at organized illicit networks. The lead detective noted that among the thousands of messages received, there were specific emails containing disturbing attachments claiming to show the missing individual. These materials pointed toward the existence of illicit underground networks. The investigators were tasked with the grim responsibility of reviewing this content to determine if the missing subject was indeed present in the footage. While the viewing of such material took a significant psychological toll on the team, they adhered to strict legal protocols. The detective confirmed that all materials suspected of depicting illegal acts were immediately forwarded to the national police and specialized departments focused on cyber investigation and forensic informatics. This digital dragnet, while failing to locate the primary subject of the case, yielded significant collateral successes in the fight against international crime. The intelligence gathered by the private team, specifically the identification of digital footprints and distribution networks, was instrumental in police operations elsewhere. The detective revealed that, thanks to the information they forwarded, authorities were able to dismantle a major network of exploitation that spanned across the United States, Europe, and Portugal. This outcome highlights a bitter irony of the investigation. While the specific objective of finding the family's daughter remained unfulfilled, The pressure applied by the inquiry succeeded in disrupting criminal operations that had previously operated with impunity. The exploration of these networks also informed the investigators' working theories regarding the fate of the missing subject. The prevalence of such organized groups in the region led the team to seriously consider the possibility that the individual had been abducted not for personal retention by a lone actor, but as a commodity to be sold into these international trafficking rings. The sheer volume of tips and the professional nature of the illicit materials viewed suggested that the infrastructure to move a person across borders undetected was well established. This line of inquiry posits that the disappearance was a transaction within a shadow market, a theory that explains the lack of physical evidence at the scene and the failure of local searches to recover a body. The investigation remained in a state of suspended animation for over a decade until a significant development occurred in the year 2020, shifting the focus entirely toward a new suspect. A German national, referred to in reports as Christian B., was identified by authorities as a prime person of interest. This individual was not unknown to law enforcement. He possessed a substantial criminal record that included convictions for severe offenses involving illicit acts against vulnerable individuals and other violent crimes. Crucially, investigations confirmed that this suspect was physically present in the Algarve region, living in close proximity to the resort during the exact timeline of the disappearance. The emergence of this suspect revived the theory of a local perpetrator with opportunistic intent. However, the evidence linking him to the specific crime remains largely circumstantial. The private detective noted that the case against him relies heavily on the testimony of a former prison cellmate. According to reports, this informant claimed that during a period of incarceration, the suspect made verbal admissions suggesting knowledge of the missing individual's fate. Legal analysts often view such jailhouse confessions with caution, as informants may be motivated by the prospect of reduced sentences or other benefits, casting doubt on the reliability of their statements. Despite the compelling circumstantial overlap, specifically his history and his location, the investigation has faced a critical evidentiary void: the absence of a confession from the suspect himself. The detective emphasized that without a direct admission of guilt, or the discovery of physical remains linked to him, securing a conviction is exceptionally difficult. The suspect has denied involvement, and the legal systems of Germany, Portugal, and the United Kingdom have had to navigate complex jurisdictional challenges to share evidence and build a case. The reliance on cell tower data to place him near the scene is persuasive, yet defense attorneys argue it proves only presence, not participation in a crime. This phase of the investigation underscores the frustrations of modern cold case work. Even when a suspect fits the profile perfectly, a known predator operating in the area with no alibi, the burden of proof in a court of law remains high. The detective expressed skepticism about the likelihood of a resolution based solely on the current evidence, noting that unless the suspect breaks his silence or forensic technology unearths a definitive link, the German connection may remain the most probable yet unproven chapter of the file. The inability to close the net around this suspect highlights the tragedy of lost time. Had he been investigated thoroughly in the immediate aftermath, the outcome might have been different. Throughout the years, the investigation has been shadowed by persistent questions regarding the social and professional status of the parents, and how it may have influenced the trajectory of the case. The private detective alluded to the fact that the family did not fit the profile of average tourists. Intelligence gathered during the inquiry suggested that the father was a medical professional of high standing, with some reports indicating he was considered a potential candidate for a ministerial position within the government had the political landscape been favorable. This potential political trajectory suggests that the family possessed a level of social capital that is rarely available to ordinary victims of crime. This perception of influence was reinforced by the caliber of individuals who stepped forward to manage the crisis. The organization established to fund the search was not a grassroots effort, but a sophisticated operation. The detective pointed out that the spokesperson appointed to handle the media and public relations for the fund was a former high-ranking government official responsible for communications. The involvement of such a figure ensured that the narrative was managed with professional precision, keeping the case in the global spotlight for years. Critics and investigators alike have questioned whether this level of support created a protection around the family, potentially steering the initial police inquiries away from uncomfortable questions or ensuring that resources were diverted from other cases to serve this specific search. The disparity in resource allocation became a point of contention within the broader community of families with missing relatives. The detective recalled instances where other mothers, whose loved ones had vanished under similar circumstances, expressed outrage at the millions of pounds in public funding allocated to this single investigation, while their own cases gathered dust. This observation raises uncomfortable ethical questions about the justice system. Does the amount of effort invested in a search depend on the victim's photogenicity or the parents' connections? The political undertone suggests that the pressure to solve this specific case was driven not just by justice, but by a need to satisfy powerful diplomatic and social interests. Furthermore, the detective hinted at the complexity of the relationships within the group of friends, the Tapas Seven, and the broader network supporting them. The swiftness with which legal and media teams were mobilized implies a level of preparedness or access to power that is atypical. While there is no evidence to suggest this influence was used for nefarious purposes, it undeniably shaped the environment in which the police worked. The investigation was conducted under a microscope, with every move by the Portuguese authorities critiqued by British media and officials. This dynamic may have hindered the natural flow of the inquiry, creating a defensive posture among local police rather than a collaborative one. A disturbing byproduct of the case's high visibility has been the emergence of individuals claiming to be the missing subject. The most prominent example occurred recently when a young woman took to social media, asserting that she was the daughter who had vanished years prior. This phenomenon, fueled by the viral nature of internet platforms, creates a cycle of false hope and renewed trauma for the family. The detective analyzed this behavior, noting that these claims often appeared inconsistent with established facts. The investigative community views these claims with deep skepticism. In the case of the woman claiming to be the missing daughter, the detective pointed out a fundamental flaw in her approach. She demanded a DNA test from the wealthy parents of the missing subject, rather than first testing her own biological parents or the family who raised her. If a person genuinely doubts their lineage, the most direct path to the truth is to exclude their current family. Yet these imposters invariably bypass this step to target the high-profile family. This suggests that the motivation may be influenced by the dynamics of social media, viral trends, rather than a verifiable search for identity. The impact of these imposters on the grieving process is profound. The detective emphasized that for the parents, who are already living in a state of ambiguous loss, these public spectacles prevent any form of closure. Every time a new person claims to be their daughter, the wound is reopened. The family is forced to endure the public debate over the validity of the claim, only for it to be inevitably disproven. This creates a cruel emotional roller coaster, where the parents cannot mourn a death because the possibility of survival is constantly dangled before them, yet they cannot celebrate a return because the claims are fraudulent. Ultimately, these distractions divert attention from the legitimate investigation. Resources that could be spent following credible leads or analyzing forensic data are instead consumed by managing the media fallout of a viral hoax. The imposter phenomenon serves as a case study in the dark side of digital fame, where the tragedy of a missing individual becomes a vehicle for others to seek validation. It is a testament to the enduring power of the original mystery that, decades later, people still attempt to insert themselves into the narrative, regardless of the pain it causes to the real victims. Behind the headlines and the forensic reports lies the often overlooked human cost borne by the investigators themselves. The private detective who led the Spanish team opened up about the immense personal sacrifice required to manage a case of this magnitude. She described a period of intense professional isolation, where she effectively abandoned her own family, her husband, and her son to dedicate herself entirely to the search in Portugal. The demands of the investigation were relentless. operating on a 24-hour cycle to process tips from different time zones, leaving little room for a personal life or mental respite. The psychological burden was compounded by the nature of the tips being received. The detective recounted the horror of visualizing the scenarios described by psychics and tipsters. When a lead suggested the missing subject might be held in a specific location, such as a basement or an abandoned construction site, the investigators had to treat it as credible until proven otherwise. This meant physically entering these dark, dangerous spaces, fully aware that they might stumble upon a scene of active abuse or a corpse. The detective confessed to a visceral anger during these searches, admitting that the thought of finding a perpetrator harming the individual was emotionally overwhelming and tested her professional restraint. This emotional weight stems from a deep sense of empathy and helplessness. As a mother herself, the detective noted that it was impossible to detach completely from the horror of the situation. Every dead end was not just a professional failure but a personal blow. Representing another day, the family remained in agony and the victim remained lost. The inability to protect the innocent subject creates a form of vicarious trauma for the investigator, who must absorb the sordid details of the case while maintaining a professional facade. The investigation into the disappearance became more than a job. It was an all-consuming mission that exacted a heavy toll. The detective admitted that the case required a lot from her, leaving scars that persist long after the contract ended. This perspective humanizes the procedural drama, reminding the audience that the people chasing the shadows are not immune to the darkness they encounter. The exhaustion, the fear, and the frustration of the investigators are the silent collateral damage of a crime that remains unsolved. As we approach the end of this investigative file, we are left to confront the stark reality that defines the case as of the year 2026. There is no body, no confession, and no resolution. Despite the millions of pounds spent, the involvement of the world's most sophisticated police forces, and the relentless coverage by the global media, the central question remains unanswered. The empty bed in the Ocean Club is no longer just a crime scene detail. It has become a symbol of a mystery that refuses to be solved, a void that has swallowed all explanations. The theories we have explored: the botched job where a panic-stricken thief disposed of the evidence, the organized trafficking ring that treated a human life as a commodity, and the sinister local predator hiding in plain sight, all remain possibilities, yet none have been proven to the standard of law. The private detective's hypothesis that the individual was removed and disposed of quickly to avoid the police dragnet offers a logical, albeit tragic, explanation for the lack of clues. However, without physical remains, this remains a theory, denying the family the certainty they need to grieve. The tragedy of this case lies in the concept of ambiguous loss. The parents are trapped in a perpetual state of limbo, unable to mourn a death that has not been confirmed, yet unable to hold on to a hope that grows fainter with each passing year. As the detective noted, in many ways, the discovery of a body would be a mercy, allowing for a funeral, a farewell, and the beginning of a healing process. Instead, they face a non-life, a daily existence shadowed by the unknown. Ultimately, the disappearance at Praia da Luz has changed the world. It has altered how parents watch their families on vacation, how police handle missing person reports, and how the media consumes tragedy. The case stands as an unending echo, a reminder that even in an age of surveillance and connectivity, a person can simply vanish into the night. The file remains open. The leads remain cold, and the silence of that May evening continues to deafen us all. This brings us to the conclusion of our deep dive into one of the most complex and heartbreaking investigative files of the 21st century. We have navigated the timeline from the initial alarm to the latest suspects, examining the flaws in security, the theories of the detectives, and the profound human cost of the search. The reality of this case is difficult to accept. Sometimes, the pieces of the puzzle simply do not fit together, and justice remains out of reach. We hope this analysis has provided you with a clearer understanding of the mechanics behind the investigation and the hidden details that often go unreported. What are your thoughts on the theories presented? Do you believe the botched job theory holds the most weight, or is the answer hidden in the files of the German suspect? Please share your perspectives in the comments section below. We value your insights and the respectful discussion of these important topics. If you found this investigative report valuable, please consider supporting the channel by hitting the like button and subscribing for more in-depth analyses of unresolved cases. Your support allows us to continue bringing these stories to light. Thank you for watching, and stay safe.